Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. The view that India has mishandled the COVID crisis is very common. However, the view that Narendra Modi's leadership quality is the reason why India has mishandled COVID is in fact very uncommon. Yet it happens to be the passionate conviction of my guest. Joining me today to explain why he's come to this conclusion is one of India's most widely read and most highly regarded historians, and certainly one of the country's most popular political commentators, RamachandraGuha. Ram Guha, you believe that one principal reason, if not the main reason, why India has mishandled the COVID crisis is Narendra Modi's leadership style. Now, in an article that you wrote for NDTV in June last year, you identified three character traits in particular. I want to talk about each of them one by one. The first, you said, was suspicion of experts and expertise. Can you explain how has that led to mishandling the COVID crisis?
So, Karan, first of all, before I answer this question, let me say straight away that India is an incredibly difficult country to govern. It's large, complex, diverse, with many problems. In the most peaceful times with no pandemic around, it would be a difficult country to govern. So I have some sympathy with anyone who's Prime Minister, whether it be Modi today or Manmohan Singh yesterday or somebody else the next, after the next election. But having said that, we've now had Modi for 7 years. When I wrote that article, we've had him for 6.5. So you have a sense of what his strengths are, what his weaknesses are. His strengths are well known. He's incredibly hardworking. He's a wonderful orator. He's great at winning elections, at making promises. But in the 7 years he'd been in power, he had failed to deliver on the economic front, on the social front, on the institutional front, on the foreign policy front. And COVID was beginning, and his first steps at handling COVID were clearly very badly done, including the arbitrary lockdown. Now, when I say he doesn't consult experts, partly it's what you observe, the fact that the people around him are essentially people he's known, often Gujarat Kada IAS officers, unlike previous governments, which had an excellent record of recruiting top-class economists who had served previous regimes. If you look at people like Vijay Kelkar, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, indeed even Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was first made finance secretary not by a Congress government, but by Morarji Desai, Shankar Acharya, Rakesh Mohan. If you look at bringing the best economic experts on board, bringing the best scientists on board, no previous regime wanted loyalty. They did not want party loyalty, let alone loyalty to the person of the leader. Added to that is Mr. Modi's explicit contempt for education. His notorious statement, I prefer hard work to Harvard. Obviously, you would want both. Abhijit Banerjee got the Nobel Prize not only because he went to Harvard, but also because he worked bloody hard at his research and at his experimentation. So, and of course, so he himself has said, I don't trust experts. And that's often the case with autodidacts who have learned everything themselves. And it's also often the case with populists. Donald Trump also did not trust experts. Look at the way he treated Anthony Fauci all through the pandemic. And to his great credit, Anthony Fauci held firm. And of course, he's been proved right in his diagnosis of the pandemic and how to handle it. So that remark was based on a careful observation of his leadership style. He thinks he knows better than experts. The experts he will consult will be those who give him the advice he already wants to hear. Think of demonetization. When he consulted Raghuram Rajan, and Raghuram Rajan told him that it would be bad for the economy. So what happened? Raghuram Rajan did not get an extension. Demonetization took place, and we are still reeling from the results of that totally unforeseen and utterly dark move.
You make a very interesting point in that article for NDTV. You write, and I'm quoting you, the fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic would have been far less serious had the Prime Minister based his policies on the advice of the country's top epidemiologists rather than his own penchant for the spectacular and the dramatic. Are you referring to the banging of thalis, the lighting of candles, the fact that on April the 9th at 9 p.m. for 9 minutes, we were asked to switch off our lights, and many people were in fact encouraged to switch on the torches on their mobile phones. Is that the sort of thing you have in mind?
Absolutely. I mean, this is pure juju. It's juju and superstition. It's just symbolic acts that do nothing. Even today, when you have, a question of vaccine rollout, why is he consulting those health experts who played a very important and constructive and successful role in previous vaccination programs, such as Pulse Polo? We've had outstanding health secretaries who helped us tackle the AIDS epidemic very, very successfully. But it so happens that those health experts happen to serve in a regime headed by the Congress, so Mr. Modi won't trust them. I mean, I know at least two of our absolutely outstanding health secretaries who did first-rate work in the eradication of polio and in the containment of AIDS, but there's no way our government would trust them. The private sector, two of our top philanthropists with great expertise in information management offered to help the government in vaccine rollout and put their entire institutional and financial resources at the service of the government and at the service of the people of India. But Mr. Modi will not take them because he doesn't want to perhaps share credit with anyone else, and he just thinks, he's a supremo who will handle everything through spectacular and dramatic gestures.
Now, the second character trait that you identify in that article is what you call the cult of personality. Tell me, how has Modi's cult of personality and his desire to promote himself, his image, and the image of his success affected the handling of COVID?
Well, I think a good leader. First of all, again, cults of personality have been widespread throughout human history. They've not been uncommon in India too. Indira Gandhi was a great or notorious example of someone who believed she personified the party, the government, and the nation. Indira Gandhi, I said in another article I wrote, was a precursor to Narendra Modi in this regard. In fact, Narendra Modi might be seen as Indira Gandhi on steroids. Now, making it all about himself. All blame must accrue to the states or to the opposition. If it's bad news, a cabinet minister must answer. If it's good news, he must take the credit. Look at this extraordinary triumphalism just a few months ago about our being the vaccine factory of the world, of our apparently Mr. Modi being the vaccine guru of the world, right? So the branding of Mr. Modi, his elevation to a kind of godlike status, the kind of placing of all our responsibility at his feet, that you will solve our problems, you will save us, you are our guide, you are our mentor, you are our leader, you are us embodied. I think is something that has intensified over the last few years. It wasn't really so visible in his time as Chief Minister of Gujarat. It's certainly antithetical to the RSS's own skepticism and opposition to Vyakti Puja. But this kind of arrogation of kind of a superhuman power, and above all, the desire to take credit for everything. Just look, Karan, at how he consistently disparages and mocks all that previous governments have done. So a bridge is inaugurated by Prime Minister A. The finances are sanctioned by Prime Minister B. The building starts and carries on under Prime Minister C. It so happens that it is completed under the term of Prime Minister D, and Mr. Modi says, I did everything. So look at electrification of villages. The bulk of the electrification of Indian villages were done by previous governments. The last mile was done by this government. Mr. Modi says, I did everything. And moreover, he doesn't say, my government did everything. He does not say, I praise the Minister of Infrastructure for what he has done or what she has done. There is absolutely no acknowledgement of the contributions of past governments and indeed of other people in his own party.
In fact, what you say brings to mind that famous account of Louis XIV of France, who once said, "L'État et moi," I am the state. Mr. Modi very much behaves in that way. In fact, it also brings to mind what Venkaiah Naidu, now Vice President, said of Mr. Modi. I think at the time Venkaiah Naidu was a member of Mr. Modi's cabinet. He said, Mr. Modi is God's gift to India.
Yes.
This is the sort of comment Mr. Modi not only revels in, but it seems to encourage. He doesn't, at any rate, discourage this sort of obvious sycophancy.
Yeah, I mean, the most staggering example after the pandemic of this, Mr. Venkaiah Naidu was not yet vice president. He was a minister in Mr. Modi's government, where he called his prime minister God's gift to India and humanity, which was shocking and depressing enough. But during the pandemic, a serving president of the Republic, Ramnath Kovind, goes to Ahmedabad and inaugurates a cricket stadium and names it Narendra Modi Stadium. Now, there was some research done by a writer in the Wire about naming of stadia after serving politicians. And this writer found it had been done in the past by Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin. Now, this is the kind of company our democratic prime minister keeps. But look at the hubris and the vanity. I mean, to have the press, for example, Karan, for argument's sake, supposing there is someone in Gujarat who deeply admires Narendra Modi, and this person starts, shall we say, a school in a small town, shall we say in Vadagam, which is Narendra Modi's hometown, and says, I'm going to call it Narendra Modi School, and it's the initiative of a private individual, that's fine. But a huge stadium named previously for Sardar Patel, whom Mr. Modi used to venerate till he became prime minister, but now he's clearly, in his own eyes, superseded Sardar Patel, and allowing a stadium to be named after himself and to be inaugurated by the president with his home minister nearby. What does this tell you? I mean, utter delusion.
In fact, this cult of personality has a very important impact, as you mentioned in your NDTV article, on the sort of officials that Mr. Modi surrounds himself with. You write, and I'm quoting you, for all the confidence and strength he exudes, he is within himself a somewhat insecure man. Consequently, he surrounds himself with yes-men and sycophants who will not question what he says or what he proposes. He has, you pointed out, shunned outstanding IAS officers because their effectiveness, their efficiency, and their intelligence, I presume, threatens him.
Yes, and I didn't take names for obvious reasons, but there were a couple of IAS officers, more than a couple I know, so there would probably have been 8 or 10 at the secretary level, who are absolutely outstanding. And then I said, past governments had looked at how good you were. When Vajpayee appointed Montek Singh Ahluwalia or Vijay Kelkar to important posts, he didn't say they worked with Rajiv Gandhi or Narasimha Rao or their suspect. Likewise, an outstanding expert on finance or on health, who had happened to serve the Manmohan Singh government as an expert, because expertise is non-partisan. If you're an economist, a scientist, a biologist, an engineer, you're not a journalist like you and me who have strong political opinions. You have technical expertise to improve people's lives, people's health, people's livelihoods, and the infrastructure of a country. So I think this bipartisan reaching out to experts was completely abandoned because he wanted people loyal, obedient, servile, worshipful.
Let's come at this point, Ram Guha, to the third character trait that you identify in that article. You say, and I'm quoting you again, he remains a sectarian Sanghi at heart. Has his sectarianism, or perhaps I should be careful and say his alleged sectarianism, been apparent in his handling of the COVID crisis?
Well, I think it's been apparent in two actions. One action of his party, one major and depressing and consequential action of his party, and one major and depressing and consequential action of his government. First, the party, and I refer here to the campaign run in the West Bengal elections, which has been absolutely communal. And it reproduces the campaign in the West Bengal elections, reproduces the campaign, the general elections of 2019. One of the differences between Mr. Modi's BJP and Mr. Vajpayee's BJP is that for all the Hindutva and the Ram campaign and so on, Mr. Vajpayee's BJP still wanted a section of the minority vote. Mr. Modi and Mr. Shah's BJP says, we don't want the minority vote, we want a majority of the majority vote. So in North India, it's in a state like UP, where the Hindus are 80%, if you get 60% of the Hindu vote by stigmatizing and demonizing Muslims, by telling Dalits and backward castes, at least you're superior to the Muslims and come inside our tent, be with us and we will together oppress the Muslims, you're more likely to get their vote. And they were spectacularly successful in this rather diabolical electoral strategy. And so they went on to adopt it in Bengal. Likewise, it's absolutely communal. It's demonizing Muslims. And of course, it's calling Bangladeshis in particular all kinds of names, which have led to a series of protests by the Bangladeshi Foreign Office that our Home Minister is calling Bangladeshi termites. And Mr. Modi has been quiet about this because all he's wanted to do for the last couple of years is rest power in Bengal. So the sectarianism of the party in that campaign and the sectarianism of the government in the very different treatment of the Tablighi Jamaat Markaz last year and the Kumbh Mela this year. I mean, let me make it clear. The Tablighi Jamaat Markaz was indefensible. It was an act of utter irresponsibility. The Kumbh Mela is equally irresponsible. It cannot be defended and it's much larger. But in the second case, the government allows it, facilitates it, celebrates it. In the first case, there was religious profiling of COVID cases going on by IAS officers in the health ministry to deliberately point a finger at the Tablighi, Markaz. So it's very clear that Mr. Modi, allows this, is happy with it. Only rarely does he make a communal comment himself because he wants to be above the fray. But when he does, it's very revealing. For example, during the anti-CAA protests, where he said, I know the protesters by the color of their clothes. Now, Karan, you know, and many of your viewers know that large numbers of protesters were wearing clothes like I am. And in fact, I was one of the protesters who was detained in Bangalore, as were many Hindus and Christians and, all kinds of other people. So this kind of religious profiling that his government does, the majoritarian kind of a plank on which his electoral campaigns are run, Hindus versus Muslims. That is what's happening in Bengal today. That's what happened in UP yesterday.
Let me try and see if I can give you an example that directly connects what you call Narendra Modi's alleged sectarianism with his handling of COVID. I suppose that example is his attitude to the Shahi Shnans at the Kumbh Mela. Remember, yes, they only began in April, by when India was already beginning to increase with something like 70, 80,000 COVID cases a day, and we went steadily upwards till we reached 275,000 a day. Everyone could have foretold that large Shahi Shnan gatherings without masks, without social distancing, were likely to become super spreaders and the virus would exponentially proliferate. But the government didn't stop them. The government didn't even advise against them. Only last week did Mr. Modi finally speak up when India was growing at an unbelievable 275,000 a day. But when he spoke, it was simply to suggest, not order, just suggest that the remaining Shnan should be held symbolically. And when the Bairagi Akharas declined to do so, he was silent. He didn't admonish them. He didn't in any way order them. He seems to have accepted their decision to defy his suggestion. Would you say this entire attitude to the Shahi Shnans, which is a very revered Hindu ritual, suggests how his sectarianism is vitiating and undermining his handling of COVID?
It's at the core of his politics, his electioneering, and his governance. I think what is clear from Modi's 7 years in power, Karan, is that India is going the way of other South Asian states. Till Mr. Modi came to power, India stood out for, at least in theory, being committed to religious pluralism. Pakistan and Bangladesh were Islamic majoritarian states. Burma and Sri Lanka and Bhutan were Buddhist majoritarian states. India stood out in the region. Now we are becoming like them. We are becoming a Hindu Pakistan or a Hindu Burma. And I think that's very clear from the actions, the policies, the ideology of Mr. Modi, of Mr. Amit Shah, of the BJP's IT cell, of the so-called Godi media, and it's incredibly disturbing.
Let me raise one more area where Mr. Modi's leadership style clearly has had an impact on the handling of COVID, and a very deleterious and negative impact. And I'm talking about Mr. Modi's decision, in fact, the whole BJP's decision. And this is true of other politicians as well, except that Mr. Modi is Prime Minister. Opposition politicians may not be in the same position of authority to carry on with massive election rallies. On Sunday, the day India grew by 275,000 a day, Mr. Modi actually marveled in Bengal at the size of crowd he'd attracted. 24 hours earlier, his Home Minister gave an interview to the Indian Express to claim that there was no connection between large election rallies and the rise of COVID. He said the rallies are being held in Bengal, where he claimed COVID is not rising. Actually, his facts are completely wrong, but leave that aside. But COVID is rising in Maharashtra. That was the level of logic which they were putting forward to justify holding huge rallies, which they know are endangering the country and spreading COVID. And there was Mr. Modi marveling at the size of his audience.
Absolutely. So, I think that was a sign of his vanity and his megalomania. As I say in my essay, he's in love with himself. Like it's of a piece with having a stadium named in his hometown, Narendra Modi Stadium, while he's alive and while a pandemic is going on. Dekho kitne log mujhko sunne aaye hain. So it was a kind of unconscious revelation of his, egregious vanity. That's what it was. That kind of statement. On the Home Minister, I'd like to say something. For the last year, since the pandemic broke out, I think the Home Minister has had two concerns uppermost in his mind: how to win power for his party in Bengal, and how to win back power for his party in Maharashtra. That's all. So the Home Minister of India occupied the post Sardar Patel once did. I tweeted it a few days ago when, in response to Mr. Shah's boasting that he's holding so many rallies in Bengal, so about 3 days ago, I said, what would India's first Home Minister have done when faced with the choice of containing and managing a pandemic on the one hand and getting a few more votes for his party on the other? So I think in many ways, this is a larger discussion, and I've written about this elsewhere, but the only person in this government who has any autonomous room to maneuver is Amit Shah. And of course, he's a very destructive influence in many ways through his sectarianism, through his obsession with winning power at all costs. And this is very revealing that in the last year that the pandemic has been on, Mr. Shah's two priorities are not peace, stability, reassurance, supplies to everyone, but how do I win power in Bengal? How do I destabilize and remove the government in Maharashtra? That's it. So that tells you a great deal about what this government is about.
Ram Guha, we're coming to the end of this interview, but there is a big picture I want you to now talk about. We've discussed in detail how different character traits of Mr. Modi have contributed to, perhaps led directly to, the mishandling of the COVID crisis. As I end, I'd like to get the big picture from you. How much direct responsibility or blame for mishandling COVID falls on Modi's shoulders alone? Not on his cabinet, not on his health minister, but on him as Prime Minister alone.
So, Karan, first of all, I began this interview by saying India is a very difficult and complex country to run, and one must have sympathy with any Prime Minister in that job. At a time of COVID, the challenges become even more, complicated, right? So we would have had trouble in all respects. But had he consulted more widely, had he been more bipartisan, had he been less focused on his own greatness, on his own vanity, had he been more transparent and truthful about facts, I think we would have been a better place today. Had he ceded more responsibility to the states, to the private sector, I would have been more responsible. But I think, Karan, he's not to blame alone. It's the craven and sycophantic cabinet, the institutions that have collapsed. The election commission should have said, we are not holding a 8-stage poll just because you want it. The Supreme Court should have been much more proactive. So I think a lot of people around him lack a spine. And megalomania and authoritarianism flourish not only because of the leader who wants it, but because the people around him who allow, permit, encourage, and facilitate.
I hear what you said that Modi is not alone to blame, but of Modi, would you agree that his character traits have made what would anyway have been a very difficult job much worse?
Yes, and I think that's what I argued in the piece from last June, that these three character traits, his suspicion of experts, his megalomania, and his sectarianism, have all contributed to making the mess messier than it would have otherwise been.
There are two,
Much messier. Sure.
there are two conclusions in your NDTV article of last June that I want to put to you quickly in case you either wish 10 months later to amend them or to add to them, particularly in the light of the gross mismanagement of the COVID crisis that we today are in all suffering from. The first conclusion is this. You write, if the Achhe Din promised by Narendra Modi in May 2014 still remained elusive, full 6 years after he became Prime Minister, it's now full 7 years, then the buck must stop with Narendra Modi himself. Would you want to add or amend?
Not at all. It must absolutely must stop with Narendra Modi himself.
In other words, if he's failed to improve our lives, if he's failed to live up to the promise of Achhe Din, he alone is to blame.
Not alone. Along with his cabinet, he principally is to blame, but the people he chose in certain jobs who did not execute their responsibilities properly. But very briefly, Karan, where have we not got Achhe Din? We have failed since Narendra Modi came. Our economy is in the doldrums. Our social fabric is much weaker than it ever was before. Our place in the world has slipped, and our institutions have collapsed. So we've got buried in economics, in society, in our institutions, and in our global image. And of course, you can't blame only one person. The people around him who should have stood up to him. There are people in the cabinet who don't like what he does, but they're too quiet. They are IAS officers or election commission heads in the election commission. One election commissioner stood up. He was shunted out, but he was right to stand up, and the others should have had a spine. So, again, I have no sympathy for Narendra Modi as a leader, ideologue, prime minister. But I think that authoritarianism and megalomania and incompetence flourishes when people around you who are supposed to man institutions collapse and surrender themselves before the great leader. So not alone the principal architect, but with a whole cast of a supporting cast of a large number of sycophantic, careerist, weak, and corrupt officials around him.
Finally, the last conclusion. Again, you mentioned this in your article of June for NDTV. I want to ask if you want to amend or add to it. You wrote, history will judge him far more harshly than his naive and trusting supporters believe or hope.
Yeah, that was very clear, Karan, to me a year ago, and it is much, much clearer now. And it's sad for us. The question is, he has 3 years of his term to go. Can he correct himself? Does his personality style allow him to undergo a transformation, a psychological transformation, which will lead him to consult more widely, to trust other people more widely, to accord credit to people who do a good job? If, for example, a state chief minister who does not belong to his party, who does a great job, can he praise them? Can he praise his cabinet ministers? And finally, can he rid himself of Hindutva majoritarianism? Now, it's an open question. It's very, very unlikely that he would undergo these multiple transformations, but let's hope for the sake of the country that he can.
Just a moment. You said it's very, very unlikely that he can correct himself. To correct himself, he would have to not just alter his personality, probably dramatically reverse his personality and become almost the opposite of the sort of person he is. Let's not talk about Modi. Can any human being change his personality dramatically?
I'll tell you one example, Karan, from recent Indian history. You know, and like me, surely you admire the works of the great British historian Eric Hobsbawm. In his autobiography, Interesting Times, which is also a history of the 20th century, Eric Hobsbawm says, He says, they have been ex-communists, but have you ever known an ex-fascist? India today has an ex-fascist. He is the chief minister of Maharashtra. Uddhav Thackeray is very different from his father, Bal Thackeray. He is more open-minded. He grew up as a sectarian fundamentalist, as a megalomaniac, as someone who believed in a cult of personality around himself. Now, if Uddhav Thackeray can change, so can Narendra Modi. And I think that's what all Indians should hope for. I think there have been transformations. If you look at the life of, people around Gandhi and how Gandhi transformed people. So I think it's very unlikely. But, if you're not partisan, if you are concerned about the future of our country, one must hope that Modi can become more consultative, less vain, and less sectarian, because that's the route not only to a better future for us, but also for history to judge him more kindly than it might.
And the sting in the tail when you give that answer is that Narendra Modi must emulate Uddhav Thackeray. He's not going to like the sound of that advice. It's going to feel like not just a slap on his face, but the crack of the whip across his back. But that, as you have said, even though you're smiling, is the example he needs to emulate. Ram Guha, thank you very much for making time for me. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.